Hello and welcome. I'm Joanna Junak and this is GFN News on gfn.tv. Misinformation about vaping in the United States has created a significant challenge for public health officials, educators, and policymakers. While there is a strong evidence that vaping is a viable smoking cessation aid for adult smokers trying to quit, there are significant challenges in communicating this to the wider public. Focusing on dispelling myths and providing clear guidance on the risks of vaping is a key part of any public health strategy. Joining us today to discuss the ongoing misinformation around vaping is Lindsey Stroud. Hello, Lindsey. Let's start our discussion with the most common myths and misconceptions about vaping among people in the US. What are they?
Yes, well, I imagine that they're the same common misperceptions that we're seeing globally. That kind of happens when you have a billionaire that, is shaping the narrative. I guess when you're going back, you're starting, when you look at the history of the United States, it was like the CDC. When I started doing the research on it, 2013, they started looking at e-cigarettes, and their big thing was also like looking at youth. But you started seeing this big main misperception about nicotine. It's probably one of the worst things that we find, that nicotine is what causes the harm, despite having, 1976 with Michael Russell, people smoke for the nicotine, but they die from the tar. And since then, companies have been trying to figure out a way to provide these products. And it seems that this consumer-driven revolution, now they're getting nicotine a safer thing. Now it's this demonization of nicotine. I think one of the biggest things you hear is just as addictive as heroin, and that's patently false. If you look at the withdrawal symptoms from heroin or any opioids compared to a withdrawal symptom from nicotine, they are just completely, apples and oranges is what you're comparing it to, and it's just really the false alarmism there. The other one is the big tobacco, brought up e-cigarettes to hook a new generation. Again, patently false. Especially when you're looking at the States. It's 2007 is when we first had, the modern e-cigarette really introduced. A lot of, issues with that. We can go into a whole different time, but it wasn't until like 2012 that you actually saw a larger tobacco company purchase blue e-cigarettes. Yeah. And so 5 years later, and then, they waited till the regulatory place. And even now you can tell that our landscape isn't good, but that's a different question. We'll go and talk about that later. But no, this is really a consumer-driven revolution it's kind of amazing actually to sit there and see how much that the people kind of, force companies to change. It's one of my favorite things about it. And then the big one now, and it's been for the past couple of years, and this is kind of coming from our industry, or, some people who are supposed to be on our side of the industry, is these Chinese illicit vapes. I remember reading something from like 2015, and they're like, 90% of, e-cigarette products come from China. Well, welcome to America. A lot of everything comes from China. Just go walk into a Walmart. But I understand it too. You have all these bad actors that didn't even file with the FDA, completely skirting regulations. Companies that are playing by the rules are losing market share. It's just this big catch-22. And unfortunately, with these Chinese illicit vapes, or so to speak, you are seeing massive declines in smoking rates. And you're also seeing this coupled with a decline in youth use as well. So it's overwhelmingly, at least with the numbers, these are adults using it. And then we have that in actual real consumer data, real actual population data, and also mostly in sales numbers. So those would be the biggest, and then there's all the other nuances, depends on what state you're going into and stuff that you'll find out with the common misperceptions. But yeah, nicotine, big tobacco, and then Chinese vapes are the big things right now in the States.
So where does most of the misinformation about e-cigarettes come from?
Oh, everywhere. Everywhere. Okay, obviously we could start with the easiest target. Michael Bloomberg for like what 25 years has been rallying against big tobacco and tobacco companies. New York was one of your first, cities to start doing, smoking bans and, excessive taxation and, his empower policies that really, shaped the whole framework convention on tobacco control and everything. He set his eyes on e-cigarettes once they came out. He's what, $1.5 billion, I think, or whatever. Then he launched like $500 million just to go end the sales of flavored vapes. And he's been really good at doing that grassroots local stuff where you get it started out at a local, a city or a town, and then it gradually moves around the whole state. And then eventually the state gets to it. And then at some point you're looking at the federal government. Then you got the federal government agencies that have done really, again, Tom Frieden was at the CDC, and he's a big homie of, he runs Vital Strategies. He was the health commissioner of New York City when Bloomberg was mayor. They're homies, okay? He started looking at, when the CDC, when these cigarettes were coming out, were pretty much alarmist. I mean, there's a reason to have the wary, the precautionary principle, but it shouldn't be to this demonization. So when you're looking at the way that the CDC has, fueled this misinformation, look no back, further than 2019 with the vaping lung injuries. We knew that overwhelmingly that these were the original illicit and the real illicit products, the THC containing vape devices that people were making and they were selling on the street. And the CDC really kind of, was not very transparent about that. And you had other agencies that were pretty much yelling at them to, hey, you need to go, they were confusing it. I guess the perfect example would be Brian King in like August of 2019 when he was interviewed by, I want to say it was an NPR person, but don't quote me on that. But they asked about what the role of THC was, and he just pivots and deflects, and he's like, well, there's ultrafine particulates and like aerosols not harmless, and kind of just downplays this, and it's kind of a shame. So, and then also when you're looking at the FDA and the lack of authorizations that they help fuel that one. And then, I mean, you just have a lot of these in these organizations that, I sat there in Rhode Island a couple of weeks ago, and one of the kind of laugh at this with the campaign. This is actually a campaign for tobacco-free kids, but doing the numbers in 2023 of the Rhode Island kids who had ever used an e-cigarette, only 4% of them cited using it for flavors. So like, this guy comes up after me and he's like, well, she talks about the 4%, but they're not understanding that, 80% of them are using. And it's like, well, you're kind of pushing the cart before the horse. Okay. I mean, if you want to address youth vaping, shouldn't you address why they're vaping, not what they're vaping? And I hate to break it to you, so are 80% of adults using those flavors. So, and unfortunately, all of those groups have been very, very good at collaborating, communicating, and getting out the same message. So when you sit there at a hearing, you sit there at anything, a lawmaker sitting there for 8 hours, they keep hearing the same message over and over again. It's going to pick up, and it's just really unfortunate. So there's like the whole bunch of misinformation, and I would like to be positive. The only way to kind of stem this misinformation is to keep going hard and putting out the real data, putting out the real information, especially for consumer advocates. We all talk about kids vaping. We need to be talking about adults vaping or using any other of the tobacco harm reduction products.
Based on what you said, in which regions of the US is information about e-cigarettes the least accurate? And where is public knowledge, especially regarding THR, the weakest?
Oh, I mean, the federal government, Congress. I mean, it's funny watching Congress be so upset with the FDA when they're like, you're the ones who designed the 2009 Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act. This is all of your fault. So, and then when FDA is sitting there getting grilled and being like, write to your lawmakers, they're not completely false on that one. The federal government, well-meaning and, policymakers that, unfortunately, tobacco companies kind of just have like a target on their back. It doesn't matter what they do; they're always going to be bad, even though they've done their crime, they've done their time. They're paying, with the master settlement agreement and everything. So, there's this this. Lawmakers mean well. I mean, I understand it, but they're completely clueless. So I would sit here and say that like where most of our misinformation lies is a lot with the policymakers. And a lot with I don't completely blame the FDA. I do feel that they're a little bit stunted, but they could be doing a lot more too in terms of some of the stuff that they have. In terms of like the states that are like looking at the state level and the regions, I mean, it's places that tend to be more quote unquote liberal states tend to have some of the most restrictive policies. So, like Massachusetts is like the perfect example on this one. They were one of the first states to implement T21 back in 2013. So you're talking even before Juul and all of this. They, when the flavor bans were coming back down in 2019 during the lung injury stuff, it was funny because it was like, Michigan was like, oh, we're going to ban flavors. And then New York is like, oh, I see you. We're going to ban them, and we're going to ban them before you do it. And then Massachusetts was like, hold my beer. We're banning them tomorrow and everything. And they did have the first state to enact a full flavor ban on menthol cigarettes and and vapor products. And now they're still going even further. They're doing NFG, nicotine-free generation proposals. And it's like, so what happens after that? I mean, what are you going to keep doing on this with the tobacco control? So I think in places that there's more money spent too on tobacco control programs, like California is a good example, that you're seeing a lot of this, misinformation. But I will note too, when you're looking at use around the country and everything, vaping use among both youth and adults kind of mirrors the smoking rate. So if you have higher smoking rates, combustible cigarette use, you're going to see higher rates of vaping, which is kind of shows, again, this efficacy of this being a tobacco harm reduction tool, and that, these are being used by those people.
So, are current regulations on e-cigarettes in the US based on the latest scientific research?
No, not at all. They never have been. Okay, well, we'll start with the federal. The TCA has the appropriate for the protection of public health standard, the APPH standard, which is like, that's what's going to determine whether they're going to get a marketing authorization. And for all intents and purposes of this conversation, if I say approval, just assume that I mean authorization, because technically the FDA does not approve tobacco products per the TCA, because that would be misleading. Go figure, ain't that a kick in the head? But the APPH standard they're pretty much holding it hostage to is that the likelihood that a user will be able to quit smoking, and then the likelihood of a non-user picking up this product, which is overwhelmingly looking at youth. They're not really looking at whether this product is safer than a combustible cigarette or not, as far as the science as that goes. So that's why you're seeing, when you're looking at like FDA, orders and stuff, look at Brian King. There was about 1,500 orders during his tenure. Only 11 of them were for e-cigarettes. It's less than 1%. Like 783 were for combustible cigarettes. And I just did the math this morning. It was like for every one e-cigarette product that King approved or authorized, more than 140 cigarettes were authorized. Mind you, smoking is at its lowest rates ever, and you have an increase in adults using e-cigarettes, and they're increasingly using products that the FDA is not regulating because the FDA has denied all of them. And I understand the youth use stuff, but in 2019, I think we'll still figure this out, that was a blip. Because it's just, when you look at how high it went up and everything, and then it went down. It's not a long-term, there was no long-term trend in this increase. And actually now you've been seeing a significant long-term trend and the decrease. So it was 20% of U.S. middle and high school students vaping in 2019. That's current vape, past month use. And then it's like 5.9% in 2024. It's like a 75% reduction. We went from 1 in 5 kids vaping to like 1 in 20, which is impressive. All the while having an increasingly unregulated marketplace and the most amount of e-cigarettes that you've ever had on it. So FDA's regulations, what they're doing is not relying on science. And it's also, again, it's the way that the TCA is kind of set up too. You can't sit here and regulate this one product this one way and then regulate this other one this other way. They could do it if they change some of the rules and regulations on, but I think that'll have to take Congress to actually enforce them. At the state level, it's all reactionary. These aren't really well thought out policies. You're seeing a lot of a push for doing tax parity. So disregarding, the reduced harms. I will never advocate for a tax on tobacco harm reduction products. I understand that, you might have to kind of acquiesce and throw them a bone at some point. But if you're going to have a tax on it, then it needs to be related to its harm. So combustible cigarettes should be taxed at a greater rate than a tobacco harm reduction product. just to, incentivize people to quit, to switch over. And flavor bans, again, they disregard the data. We have numerous years of evidence, again, back to Rhode Island, since 2017, they've been looking at, state specifically in their youth risk behavior survey, why do you vape? And you're not, even back then, flavors, yeah, they were citing them a little bit more, but they still were never the number one reason. It's always been a friend or family member. But according to the CDC, the most common reason why kids vape is to self-medicate feelings of anxiety, depression, and or stress. Which is kind of the same reason that adults vape and smoke. I mean, go figure. That's how we use our nicotine products. So when you're looking at a flavor ban, you're not, addressing, why kids are doing this. So, and you're just ignoring the science on flavors and everything. And just give a shout out to the FDA when they did just authorize the 20 Zyn products in January in a wide variety of flavors. So they do recognize it. So there's the positive thing there.